Okay, I'm over at Triangle Square, and I'm going to talk about history today. This is a woman that I didn't even know existed until somebody asked me to do a talk about her, and I started doing research. And she is the most interesting woman. She's called Eleanor of Aquitaine, who lived 1122 to 1204 in the Middle Ages. She's this. Can you please shut that off? So she lived in the Middle Ages. She was the richest heiress in Europe and one of the most powerful and influential figures, male and female, of the Middle Ages when women didn't have power, but she did. And she was born in France, and her father, as I say, she was the richest heiress in Europe. So when she was young, her father gave her a terrific education. She spoke Latin, music, mathematics, whatever they could learn. And women didn't even usually get an education at that time. And she loved music and hunting. And she was very vivacious, outspoken, willful, spoiled. I mean, she was the richest man's in the world's daughter, so you can imagine how spoiled she was. But very marvelous woman. And when her grandfather was a famous troubadour and warrior, and her father loved literature, so she grew up singing and loving music. And in that day and age, noble women who were wealthy were kidnapped and forced to marry people. They wanted their money and their lands. So her father was worried about her, so he went on a pilgrimage and he gave her over to the care of Louis VI of France, so he would guard her from being kidnapped. And Louis was also known as Louis the Fat, so not to his face, I imagine. But anyway, so she left him with the King of France. And then he died, and the King of France immediately married her to his son, Louis VII, who was not raised to be king because his brother was supposed to be king, but he died. So he wasn't really ready to be king, but he ended up being king. And she married him, and then she was Queen of France. And she was 15 years old, and he was a shy loner. And she, as I say, was very vivacious, outgoing, strong-willed, and she dominated him, basically. So they got married, and the first thing he did was go on what's called the Second Crusade, because that's what they did in those days. Everything was Catholic, it was before the other churches. And so he went on the Second Crusade, and they went together. And she acted like it was a party. She had 300 ladies in waiting. Now, this is her going off to war, okay, with all the soldiers, 300 ladies in waiting, a baggage train for all her gowns and food and everything, miles long. And that crusade was a disaster. Louis was a terrible general. And even in the Middle Ages, when they never gave women credit for anything, the medieval historians at the time admitted that she was a more able leader and more popular with the men than he was. So they came back, and they didn't get along very well. At first he really liked her, and then he got sick of it and was mean to her. And actually, Louis barely escaped being killed. He was dressed as a cleric, a clergyman, not as a king, so he climbed up a tree and hid when they came to get him. So he really didn't, the soldiers weren't too happy about that. So she tried to annul the marriage, which is what the Pope would do in those day and age, and he wouldn't do it at first. And finally, after 15 years of marriage, they had 2 daughters but no sons. So Louis finally agreed to annul the marriage, and a few weeks later she married Henry II of England, went right from one to the other, and he then soon afterwards became King of England. So first she was Queen of France, and now she's Queen of England. So there's very few people in history, I don't even know if there are any, that have done both those things at the same time like that. And she had, I think, so now Henry and she fought all the time. He was not the doormat that Louis was. So they fought all the time, and he had a lot of mistresses, and his favorite mistress was Rosamund Clifford, and he really loved her. And he embarrassed the queen with all these mistresses, and Rosamund Clifford was poisoned, and they think that Eleanor might have been behind it because she was not used to being made fun of like that. So, and she had all these children. I think she had 8 children with him, and she raised her daughters to make marriages in Europe, to create an empire, because she would marry royalty, and then they would be friendly with England, and they'd have more territory. And her sons, 2 of her sons were kings. Richard the Lionhearted was her son, and John of the Magna Carta was her son, and they both became king during her lifetime. And Richard the Lionhearted was her favorite son. So what happened was, and this is when the movie Lion in Winter takes place, her other son, Henry, wanted to seize control of the throne from his father, and he started a revolt, possibly with her behind it, because she didn't like Henry very much. And the revolt failed, and Henry the king was very mad, and he locked her up, and he put her in prison for the rest, as long as the king lived. She was in prison. He would only let her out at Christmas, and she was stuck there until he died. And then Richard the Lionhearted became king of England, and he loved his mother, and they got along great. And so he immediately freed her the minute he became king. And he went off to a crusade and left her in charge of the country. And she was a very able politician, and she was a very able administrator of the country. And he went off to the Crusades, and she took very good care of England. She married her daughters to royalty in Europe. She was like the grandmother of Europe. And then when he was on the Crusades, and she was against the Crusades, she thought they were a waste of time, and they needed to take care of England and take care of the people there, and that's what she wanted to do, but he didn't want to, and he was still the boss. So Richard Lionhearted was kidnapped, and he was held for ransom by Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire, which was in Austria at the time. And she kept the people and the nobles loyal to England while Richard was in prison, so that Henry, the younger Henry, would not seize the throne, because he wanted to be king, and he was next in line. So she kept the country and the empire together for Richard. And then in 1194, she negotiated a ransom, and she went herself. And this is an arduous journey for a woman that's getting older, and got him back from Austria safely. And he only lived 5 years more, and then he was killed in battle. And then John, in 1200, is now the king. And he is a very unpopular king. He has very bad political judgment. He makes a lot of mistakes with the nobles. They really hate him. And she went all the way from England to Spain, to Castile. She had to cross mountains. And she's now 80 years old. It's 1200. She's a grandmother. And she took this arduous journey, probably in a cart or something. I mean, these are very rough conditions, especially for, those of you who are 80 years old. That's a lot, very hard. So she wanted to go to Castile to get her granddaughter, and her granddaughter, she brought her granddaughter back with her and married the granddaughter to the King of France, the current King of France. So she would cement that alliance with France and have them not take over England's land. So she really was very astute politically and an empire builder for England. And after she did this, she was 80 years old, she retired to the convent, the Fortinrod convent, which was and became a nun, and she died 4 years later.
Unbelievable.
And and then she died 4 years later. I mean, she'd had enough, by that point, probably tired, all that work she did. Oh, and another thing she did before I go on, we all know the story of King Arthur and the Round Tables, the chivalry and the knights in shining armor, and I have this little thing which somebody just left there this morning. And anyway, she was responsible for making the knights in armor and the chivalry, the troubadours, the songs, the literature. She had a court where she made this popular. It was already in the country, but she's the one who really made it a big movement. And she supported the arts and music and was very, very educated. So, and they discussed at one of her movements, can there really be love within marriage? And all the girls and the men decided, no, you can't possibly have love within a marriage, which they didn't in those days. They were married for political power and everything, that love had nothing to do with it, like the song says. So anyway, she died in 1204, and John was king, and as I say, he was very unpopular with the nobles. And they were really ready to have a civil war in England. And this is after she died. She kept this empire of England together so far. But the minute she died, it all fell apart because he ruined it. He was just very stupid politically, and he made a lot of mistakes. And you probably studied in school the Magna Carta, which is him. That's King John. And he signed that document because they were just about to have a civil war in England, and he was trying to stop it. And that document was the first beginning of the restricting the legal powers of the king over the nobles. The first document. They immediately, after they signed it, ignored the whole thing, and they never paid much attention to it, but it's historical because it's the basis, after a lot of work from the American and English system of laws that restrict the power of the king, that the king is under the power of law as well as the nobles, and he's not above the law, and that's the essence of that. So that's the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine. There was a movie with Katharine Hepburn and Peter O'Toole, Lion in Winter, and also called The Lion in Winter was a movie with Glenn Close and Patrick Stewart of the same time period. The movie takes place when she's in prison, but they're talking about her life. So that's the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine.